Hi, everyone. Uh, Hope we're getting our week started off well. As you can probably kind of tell, this video is coming a little bit later than I had planned on. I'm just kind of readjusting back into the normal experiences of life, but it's doing its thing. If you haven't checked the housekeeping video, make sure that you've done that so that you're up to date on assignments and everything that we're doing moving forward. So we can keep things moving. This week, we are getting into visual rhetoric and visual argumentation. So the way that I kind of set these three readings up and picked them for us this week is I feel like they kind of progress into each other. So the chapter in the book, Rhetoric in Civic Life, gives you a nice overview of visual rhetoric as a field in which visual argumentation becomes kind of a sub-discipline too, and a component to it. So you start to learn a lot of the important terminology and language. You think about what it means to presence something, right? And the way in which images have the ability to presence for us. So the immediacy of visuals and the creation of something in what happens with visuals, we engage in this like process where we don't have to imagine so much or visualize through language, but we're given visuals to engage with, which means that we're engaging in presentational symbolism instead of linguistic symbolism, as we've talked about it previously. One of the other cool things about images and about visuals are the way in which it can presence other periods or moments in time. So you can take things that are old, historical, and make space for them to feel current and connected to our minds and bring something from the past into the present. And I think that memorials become a very important way in which that occurs quite frequently, and also contributes to why, as we enter different periods and moments in time, memorials become these highly contested sites. For any of us who have lived in Georgia for the past few years, we have been a part, or at least heard some conversations about Confederate monuments and Confederate memorials. Even in Decatur, right, there was, I think it was at the Decatur Library, there was a Confederate monument, and there were protests about it a year and a half-ish ago. So we get introduced to this idea of visual rhetoric, which is this assessment of our viewing and looking practices as we exist and move through and in a visual culture, which the book tells us that a visual culture is a culture distinguished by the ubiquity of visual forms of communication that appear in multiple media outlets at the same time. So the visual forms are what becomes important. So while we might want to analyze a specific advertisement, if you're thinking through the context of visual culture and how visual culture gets put together, and you want to look at fashion advertising, visual culture talks to you about the forms of what a fashion model looks like, forms of beauty, appropriateness, masculinity, femininity, to make sense in the means by which and the codes by which we make sense of those images and why those images exist the way that they do. So what becomes very important for us, and this is the like big key distinguishing piece of the chapter for you all, is we're not asking questions about what a picture represents. We're not asking questions about the essence of an image or the essence of a specific and particular visual, which means we're not as concerned with the truth with a capital T of the interpretation of the picture. Rather, what we're looking at is, in the questions that we're asking about images, are what does an image do? How does an image argue? What does the picture and its existence want? That last one is a little bit more philosophical and gets to a text by W.J.T. Mitchell on what do pictures want and the role of power in viewing. So the ones we kind of are looking at more so for us together is what do pictures do and how do images argue as we work through that. The last thing and the last kind of benefit of the chapter is that it gives you some different ways and kind of categorical assessments for how images and photographs kind of work and move in the world. So you look at body rhetoric, photographs and iconic images, monuments, memorials, museums, and then this thing's called image events as they occur. So the goal as you're reading through those sections of the chapter is that you find examples that work for you to make sense of those key concepts. So if there is one of these concepts that you're struggling with, find one of the images and try and unpack what it is they're trying to say on that image, or find a separate image and see if it works for you. If you end up finding that there is one of these concepts that you're struggling with and you would like me to go into more detail about one of the concepts at the tail end of this chapter, just let me know, and I will be happy to kind of go over those with you all. Which reminds me, the thing I was going to say at the beginning of the video, which is I apologize for anyone who hopped onto the old meeting on Friday. I should have been clear that part of me taking my comprehensive exams last week also meant that I was just like gone on Friday, and so I was not there. However, we will reinitiate me holding office hours and being in a meeting to be able to interact with you all this Friday. So we'll be back on that train again there. So back to the lecture. As we start thinking about visuals and images as these rhetorical symbols and not just supplements to language as rhetoric and language as arguments, we start to think about what does it mean for an image to argue. So we're given this article on developing a theory of visual argument, and the kind of top half of this article is setting us up to analyze a debate that was occurring in visual rhetoric and in rhetoric kind of an argumentation really generally in the late 80s and the early 90s, where there was a big school of thought and a lot of people who were like, absolutely not, images do not argue, they cannot perform and function as syllogisms, they cannot hold claims within them, they're just representations of things or something else, but it's not an argument. We make arguments about images. Images themselves do not argue. And these two dudes, Bardsell and Gorky, I'm not actually sure how his last name is pronounced, are like, we're going to say no to that. And we're going to say that images do have the capacity to argue. And in fact, sometimes the language fails the argument. And so they start unpacking that, and they start unpacking this argument that happens and the claim that gets assessed by this man, David Fleming, who says images cannot argue. And so while it would be good for you to be able to follow the argument against visuals, I find that way less important as you're reading this article, and rather I would want you to be able to follow the argument for why visuals can argue and be able to unpack that. As you're reading. And so if you can't follow the moves that they're making for how a visual argues, then we should have a broader conversation about that. I think that the best example of this that they have is the Don't Get Hooked anti-smoking advertisement campaign, where they're talking about why the phrase itself, "don't get hooked," doesn't make very much sense in isolation as an argument. However, the image of a fish smoking a cigarette hooked, whatever. That was terrible. Is where you really see the argument and where you see argument by analogy, because you compare smoking to taking the bait for a hook that kills a fish eventually, and whether or not that works out. So you see that images have a capacity to kind of hold claims within them, but for an image to work as an argument, they always work enthematically. So as we were talking about syllogisms and or language-based arguments, they don't always have to be enthematic. However, because images are dependent upon interpretation, it's dependent upon you completing a component of that syllogism and making the connection on behalf of the image, which is also why you can see images as having multiple potential interpretations, or images being polysemous, or polysemous, which just means multiple meanings, multiple. Playing with images and working through how images can or do argue is just because an image is polysemous does not mean that every interpretation is substantiated by an image. There are correct interpretations of an image, right? Or an interpretation has to be grounded in an image. Argument of an image is. So the first one is the immediate verbal context of an image. So if you are presented with an image and there is a caption, or it is surrounded by forms of language, if you are drawing interpretations of that image, say you are engaging the image under false pretenses, right? Or you're being unfair to the image in drawing those conclusions, because there's nothing that grounds the argument of that image in its verbal context. Sometimes that verbal context is as you are attempting to make a decision about what the argument of an image is, you have to look to as many or all of the parts of that argument and make sense of what those pieces going together are, right? So you can't take the anti-smoking advertisement, for example, assume that the word captions aren't there. You can't say this is an anti-fishing advertisement, or like the image makes an argument against fishing, because if the image makes an argument against fishing, why is there a cigarette? How does that analogy work for an anti-fishing advertisement, right? The visual context of the image and what you see in the image itself doesn't make sense for that argument. The last part that you want to look at is visual culture. So we talked just briefly a moment about visual culture. The way in which visual culture plays into analysis of an image is it gives you the kind of indirect influences on an image's creation. So how do cultural conventions impact our vision and how do cultural conventions decide what arguments can be sustained in the visual culture that we live in. So if an image wants to make an argument about beauty, how must it navigate the conventions of visual culture in order to make an argument about the statement or status? Think about it. How does that play out? So more importantly, while the examples for this particular article aren't super important or super exciting, I guess, for you all, it begins to kind of give us a vocabulary to start looking at how we do an analysis of images. So one of the biggest elements of visual culture that influences images for us today is speed and circulation. We are in a visual culture where we are just like immersed in images. We're just drowning in images, and yet somehow some images go viral and everybody knows the references and can see them, and it works. So an example that gets us at that is the Riot Kiss. And it unpacks the means of memification of images and the way in which those memes circulating make arguments about the image itself, and the way in which the image argues through a series of different frames. So Leslie Hunter gives us a definition of what a meme is. She calls it a virus-like cultural artifact that proliferates by replication and mutation. Sounds kind of like a disease, which in many ways I feel like I wouldn't disagree that memes are a disease destroying us in so many ways, but also they're kind of cool things, I guess. So it becomes very interesting. And if you found this interesting, I would recommend checking out, so the author of this article wrote a book called Make America Meme Again, where they look at the rhetoric of alt-right memes as they circulate through the media. Excellent, interesting, great book. But so the memes themselves are not so much an important component of this article as it is for us thinking about the way in which frames work and the way in which visual frames work. So what Hunter is telling us is that there are competing argumentative frames for our engagement interpretations of what the Riot Kiss image is doing. And the interpretations are competing with each other, and the way in which we draw conclusions about that image is based on how we engage it. So the question that I have for you all to figure out, and so I'm not going to answer it for you today, is what is a frame? Line, or the place to kind of start thinking about that is a frame the same thing as a visual deterministic screen? Or maybe not. But if you would like to practice something that might end up being an exam question, I would recommend taking the time to answer that question and figure out what is an argumentative frame, and is an argumentative frame the same, different, supplementary, complementary to a deterministic screen? What is the relationship between visual argumentative frames and a deterministic screen? To get through that, we end up being presented with Fordism, which is the truthiness of the image. You take the image as a photojournalistic image of truth and representation, and through that it becomes hailed as this iconic photo, similar and related to the VJ Day kiss that happened after World War II. And it becomes just a documentary image of the Vancouver riots. Or you can look at it through the frame of Eros and Thanatos, right, or Love Against Death, where what we see in the image is like and in the face of death, we find humanity in the loving embrace of two individuals in this moment of crisis-ish, as you can kind of experience it. This is telling me that my connection is unstable. So there we go. All right. Hopefully we didn't miss anything. So Love Against Death tells us that when we look at an image like this, what we see is love conquering death. We see in the face of danger, horror, and violence, we find humanity in love. It's one of those things that kind of tells you why that frame of reference, at least, includes a love story in almost every dramatic movie ever created, or action movie, right? Iron Man and Pepper are so important to the story of Marvel Comics because in the face of the end of the world, love. Our third frame is the frame of pop culture trends. So this has us looking more at how an image gets reported on and the trends of popular culture that engage and interpret this image in the way in which our pop culture references use the image in its replication, which is a little bit distinct from the recreations, where we're looking at the way in which the image gets memed and memified and recreated into the visual landscape through things like the Tank Man meme or the Beatles' Abbey Road meme for this image. What becomes kind of important about our use and engagement with this article is less about knowing the particular memes, although I would also love to hear some conversation about which meme or which frame works best for you all. Is there a frame that is more truthy or that works, that fits, that makes sense for you above other frames? Which frame would that be? And can you kind of assess and unpack why that's the frame that works for you? But what becomes important is a way in which we can see how we look at an image, look at people's interactions with that image, see these competing arguments unfolding, and start to unpack where our investments in life and in culture and in experience get influenced and replicated into our interpretations and engagements with what an image is doing for us, right? So the kind of last framing question becomes, if we think about our investments in life and in experience and in the visual world, how is it that an image can both be an image of sexual assault and an image of love conquering over violence at the same time? What is going on with those different kinds of investments? And what is going on in the selection of images that we choose or display to make sense of that and to make sense of our relationship to the world? And I think that that's kind of a good place to stop. And if you have more questions, then let me know. Do the discussion assignment, keep things moving. Just another reminder, there will be a pop quiz on Wednesday. it's one of 2 that we'll have to conclude the semester. So, all right, I'll talk to y'all soon.